Welcome to Rising Above It. I'm your host, Nancy Siegel. Today's topic is sex and your emotional intelligence. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Suzanne Rapley, who is a licensed psychologist as well as a professor, and she also specializes in sexuality and intimacy. She's a certified sex therapist, and welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thanks for being here.
Sure.
So tell us about your background and how you got involved in the mental health field.
I think that around 17, 18, I took a psychology class in high school and said, gee, this is interesting. People are fascinating. How they think is fascinating. What they do is even more fascinating. And it just went from there. I think there were a lot of factors that played into it, of course. And I just began to follow my passion. And then as I went to undergraduate school and then to graduate school, I was intent on becoming a psychologist. But if you had asked me what did I want to be when I grew up, I would have said a psychologist. I would have never said, well, and I'm going to do sex therapy. You know, it's sort of like, I don't think so.
That was probably taboo, too.
Well, it just never entered my mind. Yeah. And I'm not so sure I was all that comfortable talking about sexuality then. And then I had an amazing experience in graduate school, and I went to a 3-day seminar put on by the National Sex Forum. And this was while I was attending Vanderbilt University, George Peabody in Nashville, Tennessee. Okay. And it was 3 days. We did nothing but eat, live, and breathe sex. We saw everything you could imagine, everything you couldn't imagine. We had speakers of all, persuasions from all disciplines, all walks of life. And at the end of 3 days, I saw this transformation of people from mid-20s up to 70-year-olds saying how much better they felt, how much self-esteem they had, how they felt empowered with information that they'd been given. And so I said, if this little bit can go that far, I want on that bus. So I started volunteering for the National Sex Forum and the Sexual Attitude Reassessment Group, and then I became part of the staff, and then I became clinical backup, and the rest is history.
So you've had a long journey from
been a long journey.
Teenager till currently.
Yes.
And what type of people and settings have you worked in?
Oh, gee, probably, I'm trying to think what I haven't worked in, because I've done everything from work in a child studies center where we were dealing with children with emotional and developmental challenges and their families, to then working in school settings with junior high, senior high young people, to running a crisis intervention drop-in house, running runaway treatment shelter. Then I did some time in a closed unit of a psychiatric facility in Southern California, did some work in women's prison in Colorado, and a pre-state and federal pre-release program for inmates when I was living in Colorado. And
this all had to do around the sexuality?
No, this was just with the psychology piece.
Okay.
And it was, I'd already been exposed to some of the sexuality material, and so I interspersed it where it was appropriate. And so sometimes I was doing straight ahead therapy with folks, running groups, doing interventions with people, because I also was working in the addictions field at the time. And so everything just sort of started falling into place. And occasionally I would say, oh, this seems like a great opportunity to assist people integrating their sense of self in terms of their sexual being. And so that's sort of how that began. And then I began private practice and started teaching at various and assorted universities, and was actually clinical director of a program here in Santa Barbara, Kleinbottle Social Advocates for Youth. That was years ago. Okay. So I've done all kinds of things.
Wonderful.
I think it's enriched my practice.
Okay. And what was your favorite place you've ever worked with, or maybe the favorite type of client that you work with?
That is a difficult question because I find people so unique. I find them so engaging that they are all like stars in the universe to me, and that may sound, a little corny, But I really do. I think that's why I've been able to stay in this field over 30 years and haven't burned out, because I truly believe in people and enjoy working with them and assisting them in their struggles and challenges. And I love celebrating with them. You know, when they have success, that's even more fun.
Yeah, when you see the results and how much they grow and improve, and it changes their lives. It's for the better.
Yes, yes.
Which is great. How did growing up in the 60s affect you?
The 60s were an amazing time, and I hate to admit I was one of those sort of hippies on the lightweight side, but it's probably true, in my Volkswagen van and going across country and living in upstate New York and doing all those fun things. You know, that was a time when there was revolution, I think, within people and externally. And there was consciousness raising on so many levels. The free speech movement, the civil rights movement was going on. And because I was from Arkansas and I would travel back and forth from California to Arkansas, I was inundated with all questions and comments and the energy and intensity of segregation and desegregation. And then going to Berkeley for my undergraduate work and being there during the Vietnam War. And the women's movement and people burning bras and wearing less clothes. And then we got birth control pills. And then women started talking about having orgasms. And it was like, you know? I mean, it was hard to not be impacted in that way. And I really think that assisted me. Little did I know that was paving the way, I think, for, on some level, being comfortable with all kinds of people, being able to really empathize and feel with the plight of many. And I think that if all of us could do that, I think it would change the world, you know, and we can really step in someone else's shoes and walk with them and go, this is tough, isn't it? And I can see how, you know, you might feel this, that, or the other. Because our emotions, you know, are cross-cultural. It's how we express them that makes the difference. So we all are human beings. We all have the same emotions.
We all have them the same. And we're the same across the board. Our mind works the same way for most of us. And in general, you know, it is about a matter of reaction to and how we express our emotions that create our results in life.
Yes.
So, you think of yourself as a social agent, and could you elaborate more on that?
Right. Well, I think of myself as a social agent of change. And so, and I think I was very much influenced by a fellow who has recently deceased, unfortunately, a psychiatrist, Thomas Sazs, and he wrote The Myth of Mental Illness a long time ago. And he, of course, was coming out of his own culture. And so he was writing about his culture and what had happened with people being labeled and mislabeled. And I think that some other of his writings were talking out people such as myself, such as psychologists, any kind of, I think, mental health professional, or any people who are working with people, is that we have the possibility of assisting societal change by the people we work with, because we really are influencing people. We are either condoning social values and mores, or we're inviting people to pay attention to their social norms and how it fits with their own personal expression. Sometimes we're tempting them to think about if they want to be in a certain kind of relationship or in a certain kind of culture, for instance, a work culture, a corporate culture. We might be talking to them about how are you going to assemble yourself, how are you going to present yourself so that you can fit in with these people. So I think in many ways, as much as sometimes, especially psychologists, don't want to think of it as that we are social change agents, I think we have a potential to do that and be powerful and to move people in good ways.
I think you hold a lot of power as a psychologist, as a doctor, and in the mental health world, you know, because we all have to adjust to the culture and to social change, and you assist people in doing just that with the work that you do. So,
Yes,
absolutely.
and sometimes it's tough because sometimes, as you well know, there are cultural norms or values or mores that can be very difficult for an individual to integrate with their own personal belief system. And so that's a challenge. That's a delicate balance of acknowledging the uniqueness and also acknowledging the importance of finding a way for the group to accept the individual and for the individual to accept influence from the group. I think it's a two-way street.
Very good. So when you're asked what you do, you often respond, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Can you elaborate on that?
I do, and I always get a good laugh, and that's when I really feel like a 60s girl, you know. The sex, drugs, rock and roll. Let me start with the rock and roll part. And that takes me to the 60s, and believe it or not, what you wouldn't know about me was I actually sang with a rock and roll band when I was 17. And we performed, no, I'm not going to sing a few bars. I'm not quitting my day job. I still can't believe it because I definitely developed some real anxiety about being out in front of people and doing that kind of thing. And when I could get lost in it, that was great. The other piece was I was a dancer from the time I was 4 until like 25 or something. So I loved music, any time of music, any kind of music, any time of day. And I also happened to work a lot with the music industry throughout my career and just seemed to gravitate back towards music, musicians, artists, that kind of thing. So that's the rock and roll piece. The sex and drugs, of course, are because I became a sex therapist and work in the sexuality field. And that means I do everything from behavioral intervention for folks who are struggling with some kind of sexual challenge, like erectile dysfunction, or difficulty having orgasm, or maybe early ejaculation, or maybe painful intercourse, maybe low libido, maybe low desire. All the way from that up through everything you can imagine, from people who want to have more sexuality expression in their life but don't know how, to people who want to stave off the sexuality piece. I've worked with people who are struggling to regain a sense of healthy sexuality if they've been abused or any kind of physical, sexual, emotional abuse that's damaging to our sexuality. I work with young people who are struggling with gender identity. Are they gay? Are they straight? Are they bi? And then I've had the honor, and I'm humbled by the experience of working with individuals who are considered transgendered, and folks who are what we refer to as, they will say, I'm born in the wrong body. I have a body of a female, and yet I really am a male. You know, that kind of thing. So, and there are all kinds of people I've worked with in between. And then there's the drugs part, and I actually, in the late 60s and while at Cal, began working with drug addicts, and of course the whole drug scene there, and then began to work more with alcohol, substance abuse use. I've worked in alcohol detox before. I ran actually the Lompoc Zona Seca office for about 1.5 years. So hence the sex, drugs, rock and roll. It seems to just sort of, if people say, what do you do? I've never had to explain it to anyone. So this was a first for me.
Well, it does encompass everything that you've done. So it fits
And I'm not
perfectly.
trying to be funny about it, because it really, is.
Yeah. So for over 20 years, you've been a dancer that you mentioned, and then, and how do you think that being a dancer impacted becoming a sex therapist?
That's a very interesting question, because I think that the dancing prepared me to be in my body and to feel comfortable in my body and moving it. And so I became aware of muscle memory and learning dances. I had to sort of not really think, but just allow my body to move and give myself over to that. And I find myself working with a lot of clients who struggle with connecting the mind to the body, or they've just cut off completely, really from here down, and so they're this head walking around and they don't have any sensation, no connection, no desire, nothing. So I think that helped. I think also I was involved in the sensory awareness movement in the late 60s and then did some training in body therapy. And that was before I got involved in the sexuality arena. And so I think all of those things were invitations to connect mind with body. And so it really began to feel very natural for me to do that. And I was surprised. I hadn't thought about it. It was not premeditated by any means.
But there is, I can completely see the connection between the body and the mind and the sexuality, because it is part of our essence. And if that's cut off, then things don't flow properly.
They don't. And then we're going to miss a lot also if we can't think about what we feel and feel about what we're thinking. I think then we do begin to miss a great deal.
Okay, and so a few moments we're going to show a slide show, and as we do, we'll pull up some slides. And so we'll bring up the first slide. And so what does a sex therapist do?
Great. Well, I decided to use that slide, the Implicit model. Could we get it back up there on the screen?
Yep, there we go.
Oh, perfect. Anyway, as you can see, Implicit, this was formulated by a sex therapist out of Hawaii, a fellow named Jack Anand. And Implicit, the P stands for permission. Sometimes people come to me and I'm giving them permission. I'm giving them permission to think about sexuality, permission to ask questions, permission to know what their body likes and what they don't like, permission to say yes, no, maybe, all kinds of permission. Then some people want more. They want limited information. So that might mean that I tell them that as a man ages, his erection is going to be more vulnerable to deflation, or he's going to be more vulnerable to losing his erection. And so if a cat jumps on the bed, a siren goes by, somebody knocks hard on the door, they can lose it. And that can happen.
Yeah.
And so little things like that, or helping women with orgasm, or even limited information might be, let's find a website that will address this specific issue. So that's limited. Then the real sex therapy, I think, begins with the specific suggestions. And specific suggestions are the hallmarks of sexual therapy, which might mean I invite you to shut off all stimulation coming inward. No phones, no friends, neighbors. You're not going to be interrupted. You're going to spend time with your body. You're going to learn about your body. Or I may give a couple a homework exercise that they do together that will not have any, that will be called a non-demand sexual pleasuring exercise. So they're exercises that I give clients. And then the last item is intensive therapy. And that might mean that I'm not only working with the couple in terms of their sexual issue, but it may mean that one of them is extremely depressed, or one of them has a high degree of anxiety. It may mean the couple is intense conflict with each other. Or it may mean that the teen is intense conflict with family around transitioning, if they're thinking about surgery, reassignment surgery. And so I would initially probably work in intensive therapy with them using my general psychotherapy skills, and then go back to the sexuality piece if it seemed important and useful. Okay. So that gives you a thumbnail sketch of all the possibilities.
Just as general, what category of patients that you see, that you've worked with, are the most challenging to work?
What's the most challenging?
And I don't mean challenging in a negative way, just that they're faced with.
Yes. I find that individuals who have, a couple of people, individuals who have been struggling with extreme shyness, or what we might refer to as, or another category would be social phobic, so that it's very difficult to make a relationship, to just quiet down the anxiety enough to be able to begin to move forward, to even entertain a relationship, much less than add on top of it something that's physical, where we're going to get up close and personal. I think that's very challenging. I think, too, whenever there is any kind of a sexual dysfunction that has been chronic, or that has been sort of there forever, if you will, those are very difficult and take a lot more time. And I've had, I've worked with people sometimes for a few years, and sometimes I've had great success in 8 sessions.
Great.
8 hours.
Amazing.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
Sometimes people have come in and all they needed was permission.
Yeah.
Remember on that list, permission?
Right.
Piece of cake,
That's great.
and sometimes they're so happy and surprised.
Great. So let's go to slide 3.
Here we go. Great. I'm really talking here about the most intimate relation, and that's really the sexual relationship between 2 people. And, when we talk about it, if you look at the first line, it says biological. Well, our sexuality really was about perpetuating the species. So we really were living with our reptilian brain, which is way back here, and we were going to make sure that the planet got populated. Well, as you can see, we've certainly done a good job of that. That's a whole other show, a whole other conversation. Then we began looking at sex and thinking, since we could begin to think about it, there was lots of discussion about, well, is it for procreation or recreation? Are we simply here to perpetuate the species, populate the planet, or indeed, can we experience the pleasure that sexual encounters allow for? And then we go to the next line, the neocortex. I have that up there to remind us that the new brain, which is up here in the front, is really what then the next line refers to. We are able to make meaning out of our experience. We can think about our experience, and we now can label it. And so I always tell people that sexual behavior is just behavior, that what gives it the punch is the meaning we give it. And hence
so true.
the neocortex really has changed things and really differentiates us from the animal kingdom in terms of sexuality. And of course, the good news and the bad news is we can think about the sexuality we have and want or don't want, and the bad news is we can think about the sexuality we have and don't have and do want, because thinking about it can be our friend or our foe.
That's very interesting. And how do you help couples to move forward with their sexuality?
Okay, let's take a look. Yeah, just a quick slide here, because there's so many ways. One of the first things I thought of, though, is I get individuals to begin with their own sexual history, because I want people to begin. The power is in knowing yourself. There is so much power in that. And that's not, we're not saying narcissistic and only focus on you, but we're saying if you don't know yourself, who the heck will know? And you're in charge. So I start frequently with getting people to sit down and do some writing and contemplate their history. When did they have their first sexual experience? Who taught them about sexuality? What were the early messages that
Do you
they
find a
were
lot
told?
of religion?
Well, yeah, but
plays a big
we
influence
have religious groups, we have grandmas, grandpas, we have uncles, we have girlfriends, we have the directions on a Tampax box, we have guys saying, well, from Playboy magazine, the letters, or we have guys saying, well, from porn, and gee, I mean, a lot of us didn't get a whole lot of sex education, unfortunately, and what we did was often skewed. I think that there's an attempt to broaden and deepen the sexual education that young people are getting, but I still think it's such, in the 35 years I've been working in this field now, my experience is that sexuality is very personal and probably the most private and sacred aspect of a human being. It is something that people are not flocking my office to talk to me about. One would think because of the media and hype of sex. I was just teaching a class on the weekend, and I said, for such a little tiny word, it has a huge impact, and it reverberates, on and on and on. And yet the ability to talk about it and then to hold that, and to be gentle and kind and curious as opposed to be critical and shaming, is most people's growing edge. So I start there with couples. And I want them to appreciate themselves and then find ways to appreciate their partner's history as well. And that's a challenge, because we frequently we get together because we're different, and then we love all the similarities, and then as we begin to see that we're more different, we're disappointed, and then we start fighting because, well, why aren't you more like me? And it's sort of like we forget that what drew us probably was the uniqueness. And people don't realize this, but the more space there is between a couple, the hotter sex there can be.
Space how? Physical?
Emotional.
Oh, emotional.
It's not that we're not committed and very close, but when we get too close, what happens is you start wanting me to be a certain way, I start wanting you to be a certain way, I take you personally, you take me personally, and you're off and running. Everything is like a call to arms almost. And so I work with couples in becoming allies, not enemies. And especially if you want to be in the bedroom together, keep your own and allowing you to have your own emotional space so that I can really see what you're thinking and feeling and wanting. But if I'm so close to you, I tell people,
it's
if
kind
you're
of like
up
the forest
close,
for the trees. You can't see it. Oftentimes we can't see our own forest, and as well as if you're also got another person in your forest, you're not going to be able to see it as well. So it makes sense.
Right.
Makes sense. Right. Great information. Is there anything else on that slide?
No, that's good.
Okay.
No, that's a good slide.
Now, how does a person develop a healthy attitude and a sense of sexuality? That's a very important question.
It is. Yeah. It is an important question. And I have a slide. I have two slides, actually. So we'll take the first one. First thought I want to share is actually, this is from Wendy Maltz, who is I believe she's an MSW, a Master's of Social Work. She's up in the Washington State area, done a lot of work with survivors of sexual abuse. And I found this Sexual Bill of Rights, and I just loved it. And so I use it with folks who haven't been assaulted in any way, and who have, and with teens, because I think it's about us saying, you know what, we have some rights. And of course, here you can see we have a right to develop healthy attitudes about sex. And we have a right to sexual privacy. We don't have to do it in front of anyone. We don't have to do something we don't want. We can have a healthy attitude. We can like it. We can set limits. We have protection from bodily invasion and harm. We can control our touch and the sexual contact, and that's empowering. And these are all I think, the building blocks of having an integrated sexual, a healthy, sensual, sexual self. Could we go to the second slide? Thank you. Then we have the right to stop sexual arousal that feels inappropriate or uncomfortable. And this is so vital for any one of us. We can begin to be turned on by certain touches, and we'll be turned on. But it may be that it's Uncle Bill, or it's a professor of ours, or it's a date that we don't know quite, we don't know really well, or maybe it's from a spouse that we've just had a huge argument with, and the last thing we want to do is be close to them. So we have the right to stop that, the right to develop your sexuality according to your sexual preferences and orientation. And so I assist people in getting more clarity about what their preferences are. How are you going to know you? How are you going to know what feels good to you? And then to enjoy healthy sexual pleasure and satisfaction. To me, these are the building blocks. And I think that, if I had to put it in 3 words, yes, no, or maybe. If you remember that those are the words that can turn you on. And it's okay to turn yourself off, because sometimes that is a stroke of genius, creativity, and it will save your life to turn off.
Great advice.
Yeah.
Now, let's address addiction. And you've worked in the field of addictions for years. And what's the up-and-coming thing we should be concerned about that is in regards to her addictions?
Right. Well, the drugs and alcohol, of course, have always been, important. And so what I've found in the world of addictions in the last, I'd say, 15, 20 years is we've started moving into identifying a name associated with sexual addiction is Patrick Carnes, Carnes, and he began to talk about sexual addiction. And then...
We have a slide, don't we?
I think we do, yeah.
A couple slides.
A couple of slides, right. Here's a slide. Well, more people are suffering. This was actually from CNN, but this was a new piece. So we had sexual addiction being talked about 20 years ago. And then all of a sudden, about 10, 12 years ago, there was some concern about internet. And the internet's wonderful. It has given us all kinds of possibilities. I mean, it has broken the communication barrier around the world. However, it has also created a monster. And so we're seeing this idea that internet use is posing a risk of becoming obsessive, compulsive, and actually addicting. And we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Okay. You can bring up the next.
So what is addiction? Just this is a review, because we could go on and on just about addiction, but just to remind people that really we're talking about a difficulty refraining from behavior which is self-destructive or self-defeating. It's also the inability to manage impulses. It also involves a lack of awareness of one's impulses. And it's the inability to differentiate behavior from feeling states, so that people are feeling things and then doing things, or they're doing things and feeling things, and they don't know whether they're thinking or doing, which is confusing for everyone. And then the last piece of addiction is there's loss of control involved. There's this compulsion to act. And if you can remember, it's despite persistent and recurrent negative consequences. So even though you keep getting a black and blue toe because you step on your foot, you just keep stepping on your foot and your toe just keeps getting blacker and bluer.
Okay. Which leads it leads me to my next question, which is, does sex addiction really exist, or is it used as an excuse? Because oftentimes we'll see, like, Hollywood celebrities, for example, going off, having affairs, and then all of a sudden they get labeled as a sex addict, and they are checking themselves in. Is it, sometimes we realize that it could be a PR ploy just to defer their behavior. However, is a lot of that going on, or are people using it as an excuse?
I think there are people that have consecutive monogamous partners or change partners a lot, and that's part of their lifestyle. I think when we think about addiction, or if we think about a love addiction, it comes down to people who are filling themselves up with sex or with being in relation to another person. And so I don't know about these stars or any of that business. They're people, unfortunately, that live very public lives, and I wouldn't want that for anything. But if we go back to the definition of addiction, and there's this compulsiveness, and there's a lack of awareness of thinking, inability to think. When we're addicted, we go into a trance state. And then there's this notion that even though we have persistent and negative consequences, we continue. I think if we can remember that, that will help us ferret out what's hype, what's truly addiction, and what is just promiscuous behavior. And sometimes promiscuous behavior is based on low self-esteem and really a sense of an empty self and trying to fill that up. But I want to go back, if we can, go back to sort of the internet addiction for a minute. So here we are. You can see this guy totally fried out there sitting at the computer. But internet addiction, so in the last 10 years, we've seen a rise in labeling internet use as addiction, studies on it, so much has been happening around this arena, and I know we're going to talk about it for a few minutes here. But basically, we're talking here about spending so much time online that the internet use adversely affects your marriage, your family, your social life, your work, your psychological and physical well-being. And we know, a few years ago, there were these huge centers established in China and Korea because the young people were literally dropping like flies. I mean, there were some suicides from internet addiction. They were having these counseling centers set up for these young people to go to and deal with this addiction. And so I think even now, I work with people who really underestimate the power of being in that trance land, as I call it.
I look back as a child, like I used to go out inside and play.
Oh, that!
And now it's go sit in front of the computer and play.
Right. Well, and it's transfixing. We get there, and it's like television. About the trance state, and you do hypnosis. So a trance state's powerful. And when any of us go to the movies, we go into a trance state, and we think. And our body even responds as if it's real. The same thing happens with the internet. The same thing happens. So if we could show the next slide. Great. So anyway, in terms of the addict's life and the internet becomes the organizing structure for the person's life. And usually that's true for any addiction. In internet addiction, we're talking about we organize our work, our eating, our other social time, whatever it might be. We organize our life around our use of the internet. People are so plugged in constantly. If you've noticed, all we have to do is...
And Facebook doesn't
help.
And
Facebook does not help. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. I wanted to talk about, one of the real insidious parts about the internet is cyber sex. So here comes, first I was dealing with the new addiction in my practice, which was internet. And then right on its heels, all of a sudden, there was sex involved. And so cyber sex has become huge. And of course, porn websites are the most visited websites of any website.
Interesting.
On the net. They also make billions of dollars. If you want, I always tell people, this is probably a bad joke, I shouldn't say it, but I said, hey, in the recession, I know who's making money. It's the porn sites.
Yeah. It's
quite something. I wanted to just give you a few statistics that I got. There are probably about 15 million, maybe even more, today, people in the US online daily. Okay, that's a lot of people. And there's anywhere from 2% to 8% of the population we think have some kind of cyber sex addiction.
That's huge.
That is huge. When we talk about internet addiction also, we look at we look at the amount of time someone spends online, and it was suggested that a diagnosis might read like you have to have had this disease, if you want to call it that, for 3 months and be online a minimum of 6 hours a day.
Oh my goodness.
That's a minimum. I've worked with kids who are on it 12 hours a day or 15. And these are gamers. These aren't sex people, because we have gamers that are addicted also. And by the way, we could talk about gamblers who go online. We could talk about buying. We could talk about Facebooking, social networking. So, the cyber sex just happens to grab people's attention, and which I want to go to the next slide if we could. So I call it the dark side of the net, or when you go down the rabbit hole, you go into the dark side of the net. And basically, we've talked about the addictive nature of surfing the net, coupled with the allure of pornography. It goes into a lethal compulsion. And we refer to it as the crack cocaine of sex addiction, because you've got the intense visual stimulation, novel stimulation. It can be 24/7 if you want it. It's in color. Some of it's moving pictures. So that's all intense because we all know about what it's like to go to the movies.
Right.
Then you put it in a container that is open 24 hours a day, never closes down. It's not like a good book that comes to an end. It's not like the local bar that shuts off at 2 o'clock and you never have to go home.
Right.
You know, you can be anonymous. A lot of it doesn't cost much. There are lots of free sites. And there are all these chat rooms that are 24/7. So you've got the anonymity, you've got the accessibility going for you, and you've got the physiology of many of these people who are addicted to the net in this way. You've got them doing some kind of sexual behavior, frequently masturbation that ends in orgasm. And is the physiological rush. You combined all of that together, and that's why they call it the crack cocaine.
I can see how that can be addicting.
Well, and what we know is, and on some research that was done in the late 90s, was that, and this was self-report, of course, but what the users report, I'm sorry, what the research that was gathered supported the finding that unlike alcohol, which can take a while to develop, you know, a tolerance to and become addicted to alcohol, the internet is less than, well, the internet and then cyber sex is like less than 6 months. So
I would think that,
yeah,
it would happen
quickly.
even faster than 6 months.
Right. I think I've got a couple more slides, and maybe we'll go through these quickly.
Yeah.
Types of cyber sex, you know, we're talking about pornography, audio, video, text stories, real-time encounters with people, the webcam, then the CD-ROM business, you know, is just out there. And then the getting hooked. This is interesting, and so many people don't know this. It's not about the sex. It's about filling up emptiness that a person is experiencing. There's some kind of loneliness, escaping bad feelings. And believe it or not, it's a fear of intimacy. And as I say here, some refer to cyber sex as a courtship disorder. In courtship, we slowly meet each other. We see each other, we have tea, we go for a walk, we might hold hands. You know, we're getting lots of cues from people. There's a progression, a stepwise kind of formula for connecting. The people who are getting hooked here, first of all, they don't completely blast through any initial getting to know a person. And so frequently, you know, even though internet addiction and cyber sex addiction, we don't have like a characteristic profile of who, you know, is more susceptible. We do know that folks who have a tendency to be a little more reserved, hesitant, if there's a setup in any way for them to be more on their own and feel like they're alone, this is the perfect antidote, and it's a quick fix.
Right.
It's a big quick fix.
I could see how that would be
Yeah.
easily shifted
Right.
instead of one-on-one confrontation with another person. You know, it's much easier to sit behind a computer, and we often see it, even with people posting, commenting on somebody's, you know, whatever's happening in the news.
Yes.
People hide behind the computer. So.
Well, you can be anything. You can. I
Yeah.
think it's amazing. You can morph. I call it morphing. You can morph into anything. You go into a chat room, and you can be your beautiful
whoever.
blonde, you know, green-eyed self. And if nobody seems to pick up on you, then go back out, go into another chat room, and now you're a brunette,
Right.
you know, with gray eyes, and you're, you know, I mean, just a new person. So you, or you could be a guy for all that matters.
So
It's
what
pretty
advice
crazy.
do you get, can you give people that to cope with internet overuse in this day
Well,
and
let's
age?
look at this slide quickly. And I show this before I say how you can cope, because I want people to get clear what is being lost by so much use of the internet. You know, and you were saying, oh, we used to go outside, and wasn't that wonderful? And it was. You don't have people going outside. And like you, I mean, how many times do you go online and you say, oh, I'm just going on for an hour, and 3 hours go by?
Yeah.
Well, time with partner and family, daily daily chores, sleeping, reading, watching TV, friends, exercise, sex and intimacy, believe it or not, social events. Sometimes people stay home and let their families go out to the parties or the baseball games or what have you. I mean, it's a real cutoff. So if we go to the next slide, and this might be a little hard to read, but we're talking here about limiting computer time usage, putting computer in a public place, because frequently these people who are online become secretive because they know something's up. They know they're on too long, they're making excuses, they're checking, they get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, they stop and check their email. I mean, it gets pretty wild. So put it in a public place, you're held accountable. You can buy firewalls like Net Nanny or something like that to block undesired websites. Of course, the really good addicts know how to break through all that. I work with these people. You have to develop other activities. You have to force yourself to get out of the house. You have to connect with real people, and that can begin to be scary if you've begun to pull away and isolate. I think the more isolation people experience, the more isolation they feel comfortable with, and that's the scary thing. So isolation is key to breaking through all of that, and that's just a very cursory list.
Okay, so let's go into more of the neuropsychology part of it, and that you have research that our brain is amiable.
Yes.
And you say that it's something like plastic. So
I know, isn't that fun?
That? Yeah.
Well, you know, in the 90s,
well,
in the 90s, there was all this neuroscience research, and they began to look at the brain and the neuropsychology. And what we began to, we used to think that things were hardwired. And if I have that slide that was up a second ago, an arousal template, just let me say, is an arousal template is sort of the outline of what perhaps constructs what you find appealing and arousing. And all of us have our own arousal templates, and they come from our family, our experiences, our culture, our religion, what we've been exposed to, those kinds of things. And so right here, I put this slide in here because this is specific to cybersex, but it's how our brain works. We now know our brain works this way no matter what. So we thought the brain was hardwired, and then in 1998, this neurobiologist began to do research in learning and memory, and he saw that as people began to shift behavior, the brain changed. And, you know, we talk about, oh, people getting in a rut, and, oh, I can't change, oh, I'm hardwired, meaning, and they literally were talking about the neuronal pathways in the brain, thinking they were hard, and the more you experience the same thing, you know, if you get up every morning, get off the left side of the bed, put your slippers on, go brush your teeth, go in the kitchen, make a sandwich, walk to work, get home, you start laying down layers and layers of this neuronal wiring, and you can do it in your sleep. And it's deep. It's like a big rut. Well, what we found was that when you expose yourself to something over and over again, that's when you get those hard, sort of wired, if you will, those deep rutting paths. However, as people began to expose themselves to new activities, and especially like the web, if they were exciting and novel, the neuronal pathways started changing. And so all of a sudden it was like, oh my gosh, you mean what we do can change how we think? And of course there have been some books in the last 8 to 10 years about change your brain. I think it's change your brain, change your behavior, or something like that. And it's true. And so I say to myself, we have to watch what we show up for, because it's going to impact us. It's going to change our brain. It's going to rewire our neuronal pathways. And of course, something like the internet that we do over and over and over again.
And it works so quickly.
And it can work, yes, isn't that interesting? Part of the reason it works so quickly in this case is because I told you the high level of novelty and stimulation and excitation. But it does, I think, have a lot of ramifications, you know, not only for internet addiction, but really for anything that if we begin to notice we're in a rut or we constantly have bad feelings, we can begin to change that. And we can begin to, it's like when addicts are trying to get sober, and one of the things that's suggested is, and part of the recovery is frequently having to change their entire set of friends. Well, part of it is that we're getting them out of that pattern of being with those same people who have the same sort of stinking thinking, that they call it in AA, and doing the same thing over and over again, and engaging in the same behavior over and over again. The good news is this whole research with the neurobiology is also helping us with aging and brain fitness, as I am getting ready to exercise my brain every day, because they say that, that novelty is what's going to keep the neuronal pathways reconfiguring, and it's, learning new things is totally the best, and we have to watch what we pick to learn.
Exactly. We have the right to choose.
That's right.
So what is your foundation that guides your work?
I got training about 27 years ago now. Started with a wonderful mentor of mine, John Gladfelter. He was a psychologist, trainer, researcher, faculty member of Fielding Institute, which is right here in Santa Barbara. He lived in Dallas. A group of my friends and I brought him out to Los Angeles, sometimes 6 times a year, sometimes 5 times a year, for 25 years. And that changed my life. And he introduced me to something called redecision therapy. And it's a blend of Gestalt techniques and transactional analysis theory. And of course, 25, 28 years later, there's so much of me in there, but that's the underlying foundation for me, is that individuals are to be respected, and that I am fostering autonomy and self-responsibility in my clients, and that thinking, feeling, and behaviors are key ingredients, and they're going to make up our life. And so I tell people, I'm going to help you think about your feelings and feel about your thinking, and then you can make good choices about your behavior, and believe it or not, you can think and feel simultaneously. And people go, oh my gosh, you can do that? Because most of us get stuck in one side of the brain or the other and can't seem to break free.
I run across that a lot with my hypnotherapy
I
clients.
bet you do.
They get stuck either being always in their right brain, or they can't seem to adjust from left brain to right brain very easily, and it takes a little conditioning to do that.
It takes practice,
Yeah.
and I say that's what we're going to do. We're going to practice. But it is, and I think, so that's what really is at the foundation for me. Oh, and the other thing that's really important for me in my work is, and I tell everyone, of all my clients, I say, I'm going to, I work with the premise that you are 100% responsible, Nancy, for your thinking, your feelings, and your behavior. The devil didn't make you do it. It just did not happen. And I say that, and people start moving back in their chair going, oh my gosh,
But it's the
like
truth.
this is prime time here. But that's,
the
I
truth.
think, then what is really going to build a sturdy sense of self, which leads me sort of to my next endeavor.
Right, which is emotional intelligence. And can you elaborate on that? We have about 6 minutes left.
Perfect. Well, I just want to mention Peter Salovey and John Mayer. They began to talk about emotional intelligence, and they said it had to do with one's own emotions and others' feelings and emotions, and to know the difference between them, and then to use this information as a guide to one's thinking and actions. So they coined that, and then along came Daniel Goleman, Goleman, and he wrote Emotional Intelligence, and he wrote a book, Social Intelligence. Now he's got a great one called Eco Intelligence. But these people really began to look at for me, it's been a perfect match, and I've just started working with a group. If we can go to the next slide. A group called 6seconds.org, and I've just become affiliated with them. Okay. And they are worldwide, international. And what's so cool is that they support people to change through the use of emotional intelligence. And research is showing that kids with higher levels of emotional intelligence do better in school, have more friends, do better in relationships, companies that have high-level management with high levels of emotional intelligence, guess what? They're better managers. Their employees like them better. They are better at leading their company. There's higher productivity for the company. And I say, if that is, if that good can be garnered from emotional intelligence, that's why I said, it was like the sex therapy. I said, sign me up. I want to be on that bus. Anyway, in 1997, this group created a wonderful model that I think is really easy to use, and it's grounded in that neuroscience that we've been talking about, and uses a lot of the brain science that we've been talking. We've just begun to, today, just to scratch the surface of it. So if we go to how do you develop EQ, because I think that that's really important. Do you want to talk about that now?
Yes, I think that's important because people, I'm sure, I myself want to know how we can develop our IQ, and let's work on the EQ.
Don't you think?
Yeah.
Well, what's really interesting is that, and this may make sense to most people, but some people wouldn't think this. IQ is fairly static. That means that it's not going to change a lot over time. It can be influenced by illness or stress. We can learn bigger vocabulary words to do a little better, but basically it's pretty solid. But EQ is different. Emotional intelligence can be, it's malleable. You can change it, you can get better at it, you can teach it, you can skill build. And I think that's really exciting because it means that it is available to everyone in the world.
Great.
And this sounds lofty, I know, but it's
But
it's
how
available.
does one do that?
Okay, so if we look here, so the 6 seconds model broke it into 3 really usable parts. The first one being know thyself, which, as you can see from all the work I do in my psychology practice, and probably what you do in your practice, that we want to help our clients become aware of their feelings, be able to name them, and we want them to recognize patterns. And I'm sure you're always working with people trying to break patterns.
Constantly.
And emotionally, in relationships, we get into patterns, we get into bad habits, our kids get into bad habits. It's noticing those patterns and saying, are they working for me? Are they getting in the way for me? So that's the first step, is you have to know yourself. You have to know yourself. So then the second step, and 6 seconds talks about choosing yourself, doing what you mean to do, but they're talking about learning to navigate your emotions. So you're cranky in the morning, you know that when you haven't enough sleep this happens, or you know that you're really tender around a particular issue that's a family issue, and when your spouse or partner brings it up, you want to cry. So you learn to navigate those, you learn how to use them to your benefit, how to soften the blow, how to sort of weather the storm. You learn to use consequential thinking. So you start saying, how am I going to navigate my emotions to get to the goal that I want? And that's do what you mean to do up there. And then optimism. We now know that optimism, having the glass half full, makes an incredible difference rather than the half empty. And what we now know about optimism, just like emotional intelligence, guess what? It is learnable, it's trainable. You can raise your level of optimism.
I agree.
It's true that we frequently learn it in our families. It's passed on, and sometimes we have to take a hard look at our family of origins and saying, is that working for me? I know that Grandma Moses and the grandmas before them all did this and thought the glass was half empty, but you know what? That's not getting me where I want to go in my life. The last piece of the really, the EQ is giving yourself, and what that means is, why are you doing it? Why are you doing something? And to me, it's about, this area is developing empathy for others. And the pursuing a noble goal is really saying, how are we going to really give back? We have a noble goal and we go out into the world and we are pursuing that.
And people can contact you at your website and through your email, is that correct?
Yes.
Great.
Yes. And do we have time for the last slide?
We have a couple seconds left.
The
So
last second? Only because.
Okay. I don't think
okay, that was my noble goal.
We're all good. And I'd just like to thank you for being here today. And you've had tremendous amount of information to share with us, and we didn't even get through half of it. So I just want to thank you for being here.
You're very welcome.
And remember, when life gets you down, you hold the power to keep rising above it. And any last words you have to share with the audience?
I would just say develop your emotional intelligence. It could save the world, and that's my noble goal, is world peace. And I think we could do that by developing empathy.
And what do you have next on your agenda for things in the future?
Oh, gee whiz, I don't know. I'm so busy right now thinking about Halloween and my daughter and being with my mother who's 88 and just spending really quality time with her, opening my heart to her as she ages.
Great. Lots of good things. Thank you so much for being here today, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the future. Thanks again, and take care. So,
Cool.
I don't know what happened to our music, but we lost the last part of the music. So I don't know if we're still on camera.
That's okay. Yeah. They just might be silent.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just running silent, so
Yeah.
we can just sit here and
Yeah.
think that we're talking, and I'll have a drink of water. Toast to you.
Yay! So I wrote this book, and it's all about the mind, and I keep it very basic.